Okay, Rabotai. Last week we spoke about the halacha according to most Rishonim that Yashan, or Hadash we'll call it, is noeg nowadays mideoraita, whether it's in Eretz Yisrael or in Chutz La'aretz. And based on that, we presented a very difficult scenario. How is a person supposed to function for many months out of the year where there's a chashash chadash in one's food? How is one supposed to function and follow the Shulchan Aruch at the same time? It was a question that has been from the time of the Rishonim already. And this brought us to Siman Kuf Yud, Hilchot Sfeik Sfeika, and Hilchot Rov, where we have to delve into the different tzdadim, what is considered enough of a plausible safek in order to be lenient. Obviously, the L'chadchila, one would always choose to keep Yashan and not getting hit the Sfikot. That would be in a perfect world. But the mitziyut is nowadays, it's a very hard mitziyut to be in. So throughout the generations, it seems, especially by Ashkenazi countries, they relied on the Bach's opinion that Yashan is not noeg in Tvua of Akum, bein ba'aretz, bein b'chutz la'aretz. They also relied on many Shitot Rishonim that understood that Chadash in Chutz la'aretz is the Rabbanan. Some Rishonim held it's only the Rabbanan in Ayarot HaSmuchot. And since there are valid opinions based on strong sources that Chadash is not deoraita, so based on Chadash that is not deoraita, therefore we rely on the opinions that in a case of dchak, in a case of difficulty, we could rely on we rely on the opinions that b'makom adchak it would be allowed. Now, not only by Ashkenazi customs countries it's this way, also by Sephardic countries we've seen that that the Sefer Simchat HaKohen from Jerba writes that we could be mitzar of the Bach to a Safek Safeka. We have the opinion of Rabbi Shalom Misas is apparently said also that we were lenient, that there's no Chadash in Chutz La'aretz. This Deichemet doesn't seem to say, well, Sephardim have no right whatsoever to be Mekel. He does bring the Mekel opinions. That's not a clear raya, but you don't see the Sephardic poskim really coming out very strong and saying it's asur. We suggested it could be because in their countries, the Yashan was mostly planted in a season where you didn't have a problem. But Afal Pichen, there are sources that clearly say we can rely on the Bach. Rabbi Ben Bashaul seems to rely on the Bach. Also in the Sefer, as a Sfek Sfeka, he says, obviously, and a Safek only to rely on Shabbat. Also the Sefer Yalkut Yosef writes that B'tziruf Safek Safeka, one could also rely on the Bach. So it does seem that there are legitimate poskim that even by the Sephardim, that didn't push away the Bach's opinion totally, even though the Shulchan Aruch doesn't hold that way. Furthermore, we mentioned last week that there could be different situations of a suffix that want us to examine when they apply. Number one, if you have Rov Yashan and Miut Chadash, even though Chadash is a davar sheyesh lo matirin, it's something that eventually is going to be allowed next year. Nevertheless, the poskim say that we don't say davar sheyesh lo matirin by Chadash because it's already made into chametz, and you have to get rid of it. This is not going to last after Pesach. You're not allowed to keep it after Pesach. So they don't consider that a davar sheyesh lo matirin. There's a tshuva like that from the Shulchan Aruch Harav in the end of Hilchot Pesach. And it seems to be that's the opinion of the majority of the poskim. Rav Shlomo Miller wrote this in the tshuva as well to me in the years Tafshin Samechei, that as long as you have Rov Tevuat Yashan, then you could rely that it's allowed. And that's what the Rishonim, the Tshuvot Arosh, they say as well. Now, if you have, they're talking about a different scenario, but they write the Rov. Furthermore, the Tur and the Rosh and the Bet Yosef all write that if you have a Safik, not Safik like the Bach, but a Safik if it's last year's Tevuah or even this year's Tevuah, but it was this year's Lifnei Omer, that's also allowed. We also mentioned that there are some poskim that say a Sfeik Sveika, even if it's not a Safik Ashakul, it could also be mitzdaref to a Sfeik Sveika. So now that we examined all of these different aspects and dimensions, let's speak a little bit about what is the market, the grain market in America. And basically, I would like to suggest and present today a suggestion how in America, not the Canada, how in America one could keep Yashan, for the most part, relatively easy. If I would make a poll by most people, I will find out they don't keep Yashan at all. That's the reality. I'm telling you, my boots on the ground, most people I speak to don't keep Yashan. You have to give them lists. It's hard for them to look at lists. It's not something that's easy. Many people don't even know what Yashan is. Somebody told me that he spoke to a Rav, a Sephardic rabbi, who asked him if rice is Yashan or not. So, rice is not one of the 5 grains. Yashan is on the 5 grains. And there was somebody else who said that he asked the mashgiach right after Pesach if everything in the restaurant is Yashan. And the mashgiach said, wait, let me find out. Obviously, right after Pesach, everything is Yashan. It will only apply in September time. So, just to be clear, the Torah says that anything that was planted after the Omer and harvested and ready to eat at your table, if it didn't see the next Pesach, you can't eat it. That's the Torah. It's a pasuk in the Torah. Anything that was planted before Pesach, 3 days before Pesach, most poskim hold. And that's how we follow le'alacha. 3 days before Pesach. Or it was planted way before Pesach, and it was produced way before Pesach, but it's saw Pnei Omer, then you're allowed to eat it. So, we're in an interesting society, we're in an interesting situation over here, that it could be historically, we were never in such a situation, where we are in a country where there is over 350 million people, a country that you have different climates, and you have mass production. And what it makes it even more difficult is that there's not one central wheat shipping station for all of America. There are around 450 different mills scattered across North America, that each mill is independent and ships its flour out to different destinations. So you are presented with a situation where it is almost impossible to know exactly what wheat they are sending out. But we know there are a few guidelines. Let's start with the following. In America, there's about 1.65 billion bushels of wheat that are produced. One of the largest productions of wheat in the world. Now, there are 2 types of crops. There is winter crop, and then there is spring crop. There's winter wheat and spring wheat. Winter wheat doesn't mean that it was planted in the winter and it is older than the spring wheat. Winter wheat is harvested in the spring, but it stays dormant in the ground for a long time while the ground is frozen. And then you have something called spring wheat, where spring wheat is planted around April or May time. All of the details I'm telling you is very important, so follow with me. Spring wheat is planted around April and May, and it is harvested around July and August, and can get to your table by the end of August or September. That is the two markets those are two markets that produce two types of wheat. In truth, if you want to break it down even more, there are 6 types of wheat, okay? There's hard white wheat, which is grown mostly for pan breads, tortillas, flat breads, and that's hard white winter wheat. Then there's soft red winter wheat, which is usually used for cookies, crackers, pastries, flatbreads, pretzels. It's usually made for Maker's Mark. Soft and hard is, the way I understand it, is soft. Soft means there's less protein, less gluten strength and lower protein. Okay, then you have hard, soft white, which is it's naturally white color, and it's usually made for Triscuits and Asian style bakery products. Then you have hard red spring, which is planted in the spring. Spring wheat is higher in gluten, and it also higher in protein. And people use it for breads, rolls, croissants, bagels, pizza crust. And then you have durum wheat. Durum is the hardest of all types, and it has it's very high gluten, and that's why they use durum for pasta. So just to simplify, just try to remember the following. Winter wheat is less gluten, which means less elasticy, which is more crumbly. Spring wheat is more gluten, more elasticy, and durum is pasta. Okay? Let's start with wheat in America. 70% of the wheat in America is winter wheat. If you take all the wheat in America, 70% of it is winter wheat. Winter wheat, by definition, is always yashan, because it's planted in the winter and it's harvested in spring, so it always saw Pesach. So most of the wheat in America is yashan. Spring wheat is mostly planted after Pesach. There are some years and some locations where spring wheat is planted right before Pesach, but that varies between 3%, 5%. It's very negligible, not a lot. Most of the spring wheat is after Pesach. So it comes out, and then Pasta will discuss soon. It comes out that what would be the halacha if I would walk in the street and I would see a piece of meat, and I don't know if the piece of meat is kosher or not? What does halacha dictate? The halacha dictates is that if I don't know if it's kosher or not, we go according to the majority. We go according to the rov, right? And rov behemot kshirot, we could assume that this behem is kasher as long as you know it's shechted properly. So I would think as well, if I go and if I see something, if I see flour, if I see a bag of flour, and I don't know if it's yashan or chadash, even if I'm in the middle of January, where there is chadash on the market, but most wheat in America, even in January, is winter wheat. So I could assume that this is wheat that I can consume. No, it has no indication on it whether it's spring or whether it's spring or whether it's winter. I could rely on rov. I think that's logical, correct? Now let's take it a step further. There are certain items that they only use for winter, winter wheat. As I mentioned to you, cookies, crackers, pretzels, all of that is all made from crumbly material. They will not use spring wheat. And even if they do, it's a very negligible minority. Cakes are usually made from cake mix, which is mostly winter wheat. So if I go into a store, and I don't know if it's Yashan or Hadash, if it's anything in the category of cakes, cookies, pretzels, muffins, which is made out of cake mix, all-purpose flour, breadsticks, all of this I could assume is Yashan, because I go according to the Rov. I don't even have to come on to Sfeika over here. If I go into a bakery and I want to buy bread or pizza or bagels, the bakers will tell you that they will mostly order high gluten flour, which by definition is spring wheat. Most spring wheat in America is Hadash. So those are items that a person should stay away from for a few months out of the year. The lists are telling you it's Vada Yashan. I'm not discussing the lists. Anybody who is able to follow the lists, Tavo Alem Birkat Tov, that is the best. I'm talking about a consumer that is not ready to jump in fully into keeping Yashan and everything. What is mutter al pi halacha or not? If you keep Yashan, could you go to somebody's house and have it and eat food from his kelim? Last week we said that since there is an opinion of the Bach and others, and since it is an opinion that was followed, it shouldn't forbid the kelim. We also mentioned that by Ktanim, you don't have to be machmir, since there are shitot that say it's allowed, and the Pri Megadim says whenever there's a machloket, you can rely from Ktanim that it's allowed. But in regards to you yourself, you walking into a store, you want to know what's allowed. So let me tell you an experiment that we made a few weeks ago. A friend of mine, and I walked into one bakery that wasn't Yashan. It doesn't keep Yashan in Los Angeles. Baruch Hashem, in our neighborhood, most bakeries keep Yashan. Keep Yashan means they pay a little bit extra, and they have storage for spring wheat from last year that is kept, and it's Yashan spring wheat, and their bakery is Yashan. And we walked into a non-Yashan bakery. We checked out his flour. It was spring wheat, and according to the research that we made with the producer where it was from, it seemed to be it was Hadash. It's Hadash. But he didn't use that spring wheat for all the products in his store. He used it for breads, bagels, pitas, anything that is soft. So I said, what is this? He had another pile of cake mix. Cake mix was winter wheat. If it's not fully winter wheat, it's mostly winter wheat. And it's definitely got a sfeika in there, a suffix whether it's winter or spring, or a suffix maybe from last year, but it's rov winter wheat. So he says, well, this I use to make my cakes, my cookies, my muffins. So right away I knew somebody who walks into a non-Yashan bakery, at least he could buy his cakes, he could buy cookies, he could buy muffins. And I think you could apply that to all bakeries, because a regular bakery is not going to use spring wheat for cookies because the cookies are going to come out too soft. Then you have I decided to visit some pizza stores. In the pizza stores, I discovered that a pizza store that had an option of keeping Yashan and Hadash, in other words, Yashan or non-Yashan, their non-Yashan, listen to this, was winter wheat. So this, I discovered something very interesting, that you can make pizza, which requires high gluten, out of winter wheat as well. I went to another pizza store that also doesn't keep Yashan, and I found that their wheat didn't say if it was spring or winter, and the company that they got their wheat from advertises that they take from both. So by pizza, I really don't know what I would assume that it's mostly from spring wheat, but I did have a legitimate suffix that there are sfikot over here. So once I'm in doubt that sometimes pizzas, or it's possible that pizza could be winter wheat, or it could also be spring wheat, I can't treat it with the same chumrah as breads. Although l'chorah, it shouldn't make a difference, but this is my experience that I saw. I'm just pointing out to you the sfikot that I had. I went to another bakery that's Yashan, and I confirmed that for his cakes, he doesn't use spring wheat. He only uses cake mix, which is once again winter wheat. And the more I looked into it, those were my maskanot. So basically, in my experience of visiting these places, it confirmed what I mentioned to you. Anything like breads, bagels, pizzas, usually spring wheat. If b'di'evad, one is in a situation that he's found in a situation with bread that's Hadash, so what he has to rely on is the bach, which is not so simple. So it's kedai lahachmir, not like the bach. For ktanim or for kalim, you could be meiko. Besides that, it's tov lahachmir. I can't say it's asr be'ikar adin, because if you would say it's asr be'ikar adin, then the kalim should also be asr. And where would you think that you're able to walk into a store where they have shrimp and kosher meat next to each other and buy the kosher meat, not buy the shrimp? Lo yitachin. So from the fact that we do that, we buy in stores all the time that sometimes they have chadash and yashan throughout the year, and even if I'm not buying now, I only buy months before, months after, but their whole kitchen is treif. So obviously I'm not mityaches like vada yisr. So that's my smach to say that you can't aser b'di'evad, but definitely tov la'achmir. Now moving on to other products. I'm sorry, not moving on to other products. Another reason why I'm suggesting that if somebody has a situation where he has bread in front of him, that he doesn't know if it's yashan or chadash, there could be another suffix that you could be mitzdarif. And this Reb Shlomo Miller writes in his tshuva that he wrote to me in Tavshin Samech Hey. And there's a lot of controversy in this, whether it's a real suffix or not. All right. Every single mill will keep a certain amount of storage in their silos. They call it elevators. One person that I asked, a distributor, the only way you're going to find out what is called yashan and what was from last year, what was from this year, is literally you have to go down to the mill, and there are no rules. Whatever is good for them, they will do. So one distributor I spoke to, he spoke to his guys, and they came back to him and they told him the following. I'll read it out to you. They came back and they told him that this was my question. Do mills ever mix flours? Sometimes you have spring and winter. So they say we mix wheat from previous crop years. I say thank you. Even when you sell high gluten flour to bakeries, they sometimes are mixed with winter or last year's spring. It says there are times where winter wheat can be blended with high gluten flour if the winter wheat protein levels are high in a particular year. As far as last year's spring wheat crop, yes, it is possible that we would be using last year's crops when producing high gluten flour. They also kept more in reserves because they weren't sure how much of the trains were working properly with the chain supply problems going on in America. So there are mills that are going to be giving you wheat from last year. There are mills that aren't. There's no way of knowing what the percentage on that is. But if you go with the poskim that you're mitzarif, a suffix, even if it's not shakul, you have a sfeika here. Suffix like the bach. And even if you want to say the halach is not like the bach, a suffix, maybe this was from last year's tvua. Besides that, you could be mitzarif also that some of the tvua was planted before the omer in some places, which is very little, but still, it's chazilitz terufe a little bit. So you have over a suffix shein shekel means even a little bit of a percent, because the Pri Chadash says one suffix is palgo palga and the next suffix tips the scales. So you have a little bit of a sfeik sfeika even on spring wheat. It's not a lechatchila sfeik sfeika, but you can't say it's not shayach. But when you're going to go to all-purpose flour, you have rov wheat in America as yashan. Besides that, you have a sfeik sfeika. So therefore, I think that on most products, you could be lenient. On certain products, you should be machmir, which is not that hard. It makes it much easier. Pasta. So pasta, most durim, is spring wheat. But once again, if you go into a store, you'll see Israeli brands that are always yashan, because in Israel, Hadash it's not chutzlar. There's no leniencies of chutzlar. So all the reliable hechsher, anything coming from Israel is yashan, and that's also their crop season. Is the way they get their wheat is also fine. Number two, if you're going to be getting pasta from Hamisha brands, there's Mishpacha, California Delight, Strites. That's always yashan also. But if you can't find that, you're in a market. What type of market do you have? The general market there. How do you call it over there? You're in a Whole Foods or whatever else, whatever you call your markets there. So then you're in a market. What you could look for is something that says made in Italy. You have a brand called Barilla that says product of Italy, but it's not made in Italy, and they actually got sued for that. That's American-made wheat. If you take a look at a package that says made in Canada, you should for sure stay away from. Canada is mostly spring wheat because they only plant later on in the spring. They can't even do winter wheat because it's so cold there. So most of the wheat coming from Canada is a problem. So they have shayarot mitzuyot, which you spoke about last time. Which, by the way, I have to correct something. I said that the Levush says that the reason why you're allowed to when the gates of the country are open, you're allowed to eat from the produce, is because there's a heter tolin, even though there's no rov. That was a mistake. I saw the Levush inside, he says there is a rov, but the Hagot, there is, in other words, when you opened up the gates of the city, rov of the stuff that came in was yashan. The Hagot Mara Azulai, Rav Avram Azulai, great-grandfather of the Chida, he writes that you're able to be tolin even if you don't have a rov. So maybe in Canada they have a heter of a rov. I don't know. But anything that says Canada and America, you should, they have a heter of tolin, I'm sorry. Anything that's Canada and America, you should stay away from. But there are things that say made in Italy. There's a lot of pastas that are made in Italy. In Italy, 2 out of the 3 bags made in Italy are made from Italian durum. I have research I did on this. Italian durum is yashan. The planting season is yashan. So one could rely, if it's made in Italy, that it's permitted. I spoke to a few big poskim about this and they agree. So if you have pasta issue, you could buy made in Italy. What else is a problem? Oats. According to planting season that I found out, 25% of the oats that are planted in America are planted before the Yomer. So you have a strong suffix, 25%. So you have suffix the Bach, suffix it was planted before the Yomer. So that's a strong suffix. And suffix maybe it was last year. So you have 3 sfekot over here. Barley, 10% is planted before Pesach. So you have the Bach, 10% before Pesach, plus maybe it was last year they were keeping it stored where nobody is going to be able to find out. So being mitzaref, all these things together, if you're bimakom that you're in a tchak, there are leniencies to rely on oats, on barley, on pasta if it's made in Italy. So that's more or less a rather easy way to keep yashan. If you're in a situation where you don't have the list, you can't do the lists, you stay away from breads, from bagels, from pizza. You did 80% of the job with 20% of the effort. That's what Rabbi David Cohen from Chicago hits his line. You did 80% of the job with 20% of the effort. So that's for somebody who doesn't do the lists, but you want to keep mostly yashan. That's the way to do it. Pasta is easy how to do it. Other stuff, we said there could be leniencies. Kalim and Ktanim, you're allowed, and Shalom al Israel. So that is how the American Hadash market works. That's different than the Rishonim. The Rishonim had to use sfekot that were less, that were not as much of a sfekot that we have nowadays. Nowadays, you have to remember, they're so complicated, the wheat market, there's no way of knowing what's going on. What would the Rishonim say on such sfekot? It would seem to be that, like how we spoke about, it's allowed, and that's indeed more or less the crux of what Rav Shlomo Miller wrote in his Teshuvah in Tafshin Samechei, and I spoke to him recently about this as well, and this is his position on the matter. And there are many Sephardi poskim that are behind this initiative, this idea as well. Okay? Chazaku Baruch Rabotai.